Welcome to the third episode of Fiction and the Fantastic. I'm Marina Warner, and a regular contributor to the LRB, and a writer who's often explored myths and fairy tales. I'm delighted to be joined by the writer and scholar Della, also a regular contributor to the paper, and author of Accidental Gods on Men Unwittingly Turned Divine, a splendid multidisciplinary study. In this episode, our close reading will focus on Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, a slim novella that yet contains riches and multitudes. As a work of literature, it is highly conscious of forerunners and plays with many echoes of subjects we have explored earlier, the tale-spinning of the knights and the wonders encountered by Gulliver in his travels. Calvino practiced flights of imagination and pursued the wonderful and the strange in order to propose possibilities and different pathways. Above all, Calvino drew on the Travels of Marco Polo, the 13th century Venetian merchant who crossed vast distances of the then-known world and met the Emperor of China and came back to tell the tale. Calvino casts him as his protagonist and mouthpiece, and will look at the way Invisible Cities engages with his source across the centuries, and how they both figure in the tradition of the fantastic by realizing in words worlds elsewhere. So first of all, Della, when Invisible Cities came out in 1972, what kind of book did the public find?
So Invisible Cities has a very unique structure. It's 55 cities that are grouped by different themes. Cities and memory, cities and desire, hidden cities, cities of the dead. And they're encompassed by the frame narrative in which Marco Polo is telling Kublai Khan of all these places he may or may not have traveled to. And I should mention that this is described as taking place at bedtime. It's kind of in the evening that Polo is telling these stories to the Khan, very much like Scheherazade. There's this kind of nighttime dream work to this scene. And each of these cities captures something that's true about all cities everywhere. And Polo tells the Khan at one point that they're all iterations of Venice, his home city as well. And so Invisible Cities was published in 1972, and we're using William Weaver's translation.
There are 9 chapters. It's actually very difficult, I think, for a reader to see what the hidden important structure to Calvino, what it is. But it does mean that this is a very lapidary book. It's very small. And it reminds me a little bit of Rimbaud's cycle of poems, The Illuminations. And, they are like illuminations. They are like magic lantern slides, each city. Some are longer and more meditative and more essayistic even. And some are very, very short. I mean, 1 paragraph only. So the book, when you open it, is a scattering of paragraphs. It's it's barely, how many pages is it? It's 127 pages, and this world of riches. It's interesting because the Travels of Marco Polo is very long and very dense, but this is dense in a different way. This is dense in the way that poetry is dense.
It's also very much a description of the whole world, just like Marco Polo's own text is describing the whole world. And the frame story between Polo and the Khan is kind of woven in between these cities. And Polo is the narrator, but then at a certain point, it's almost as if their minds begin to meld, or the Khan at one point kind of tries to take over telling the stories. He says, now I'm going to describe the cities, and then you go out and find them and see if they're real. And they describe a kind of template of an ideal city, which Polo relates is made up of all the contradictions and absurdities and exceptions that one might find in any city. And then you keep subtracting these abnormalities and you'll reach the ideal city. But then Polo counters that this would create cities too probable to be real. This idea of them being too probable to be real is really the kind of feeling of the reader as you're traveling inside them. They do seem very real, and part of that is the beauty of Calvino's language.
He also involves us, the readers, because he often uses you. He often addresses us. It may be Marco Polo directly addressing the Khan, or it may be the Khan directly addressing Marco Polo. We don't know, but because he calls us you, and it's a you that's almost like an I. So you find yourself in a street. So it could be I find myself in a street, but this is very intimate, and it really does wind us in to these extraordinary landscapes and scenarios.
You feel like you're dreaming them at the same time, and you're kind of, it's almost like a nesting of everyone's dreams of the cities and of each other. The Khan's dream, Polo's dream, the reader's dream, and Calvino's.
There is an existential sort of melancholy that hangs over it. I mean, there are very few relationships. In fact, I mean, the relationship between the Khan and Marco Polo is probably the strongest relationship that's described, and it's not much of a relationship. So there's an estrangement that's also to do with the wonderful at the heart of the book.
It's almost that feeling of, from Gulliver, of the islands as kind of blank slates or kind of fields, empty fields where games can be played out and they're inventing their own rules as they go along. It kind of unfolds on this space of kind of play according to its own logic.
Yes. Could you say a little more about how the cities, these fantastical cities, relate to Venice?
So each city captures something true about all cities everywhere. And at one point, Polo reveals to the Khan that they're all versions of his hometown of Venice. And in some ways, this is true in a literal sense. A lot of them are cities of canals with water, like the city of entirely made of plumbing where the water nymphs live. But on a deeper level, it captures this idea of, no matter how far you travel, you're kind of always stuck with yourself and you're always looking for a home and you're always seeing things through that perspective. There's one city that's described as changing with the mood of the beholder. And so Polo is holding Venice in his sights as he travels to all of these different cities. He narrates.
So these cities are fantastical and improbable in many, many different ways. But in what way are they invisible?
I suppose I would ask, are they invisible? Calvino describes these cities with such precision and clarity that it creates that moment of hesitation that we've spoken about before that really defines the fantastic. That hesitation between the illusory and the real that makes you think, wait, have I been there before? I think I've seen that city. I think maybe I visited it. And of course, Polo's talking about, a city made entirely out of plumbing. That's the residence of water nymphs. So the novel's been described as like a prose poem, but it also, under this title, Evoking Invisibility, it has a deeply cinematic quality, which is so striking as Calvino's earlier engagement with Marco Polo came in 1960, so a decade before he started writing Invisible Cities, when he was commissioned to write a detailed outline for a film about Marco Polo that would blend the kind of documentary and the fantastic in recounting the travels. And he writes kind of wonderfully in a letter about how he started going about thinking of Marco Polo. So maybe I'll read a little bit from that.
Do.
It is time for me to tell you how I have gone about starting work on Marco Polo. To reach that minimum of arousal of the imagination that would allow me to work on this project, I had to read Marco Polo's Il Milione over and over again, even the bits that least lent themselves to narrative, in order to absorb that visionary charge that is the book's secret. In short, I tried to follow Coleridge's method. By smoking opium and reading Marco Polo, he managed to compose in a dreamlike trance, and Xanadu did Kublai Khan. I don't have any opium to hand, and I don't know what will come out of this. But it seems to me that what we have to emphasize is the spectacle of the wonders of the world, as they might have been conceived at a time when the world was unknown. And so the film was kind of perfectly never made. but something did come out of it eventually, which is Invisible Cities.
There's a tension, though, isn't there, between what Marco Polo was reporting and what Calvino is doing, which is basically dreaming. I mean, he describes that in the letter. He was having an opium dream, as it were. So how was Marco Polo's travels received? This reference you made to Il Milione, Calvino made to Il Milione, was his nickname because it was learned that he was in the prison in Genoa telling these fantastic stories, Marco Polo, and he became nicknamed Il Milione because of a million tales that he told. And at that point, he wasn't believed. At that point, the Travels of Marco Polo was seen as fantasy. And that has changed. That status has changed.
Yeah, the text is this kind of accumulation of marvels upon marvels. And in many ways, it reads like a kind of long, strange dream, but it's at the same time rigorously detailed as empirical, as Marco Polo is relating his 24-year-long travels to the farthest reaches of the world. But I guess just to situate Marco Polo a bit, he was born in 1254 into a family of Venetian merchants. And before he was born, his father and his uncle set off on an earlier trading voyage to the Mongol Empire. But by the time they returned, Marco was 15 and his mother was dead. And 2 years later, Marco sets out on another grand journey to them back to the court of Kublai Khan. And in Calvino's film treatment, he describes Marco as sneaking onto the boat with his father. But it's remarkable that Marcos really spends his entire childhood without ever meeting his father, and then sets off on this epic journey with him, which...
There's a connection with Calvino's own biography because it was in the prison in Genoa that Marco Polo told his stories to Rustichello, who was quite a famous writer, in fact, a writer of Arthurian romances, who happened to be in the same prison with him. And it was he, Rustichello da Pisa, he was called, who took down the conversation of this astonishing fellow inmate he had in the cell. And that Genoa is on the same Ligurian coast as where Calvino grew up. So though Marco Polo was a Venetian, in terms of his authorship, he was actually a Ligurian, which is the same because Calvino was brought up in Sanremo. So he was not only just a compatriot, an Italian compatriot, but also a closer compatriot in some ways. This great writer who, hundreds of years before, had produced this extraordinary tale of adventures and wonders.
So they have this kind of ancestral resonance between the two figures over the centuries. So I guess just to capture a little bit about Marco Polo's journey, at the centerpiece of it is his encounter with Kublai Khan, who at the time is about 85 years old, and he had greatly expanded the Mongol Empire during his rule. And Marco Polo kind of realizes, being drawn into his court, that Kublai Khan wants to know about his empire, and he's dispatching emissaries across his territories, and they come back and they have nothing to say about what they've seen. You know, they're boring the emperor with their accounts. So Marco realizes that in order to really ensure his livelihood at the court of the Mongol emperor, he has to captivate the Khan with his storytelling.
There's also a shadow underneath this, of course, of Kafka, because Kafka has very many stories about the Emperor of China and the message from the emperor to his people, and the emperor is dead by the time the letter reaches them, the person it's destined for. And so this phantasmagoric empire has a life in literature.
And Calvino really picks up on this kind of mood in Invisible Cities, where he describes in the frame Marco Polo is kind of sensing that Kublai Khan has fallen into a kind of deep gloom around the twilight of his empire. And Marco Polo describes the storytelling as a kind of beautiful way to bring light into that darkness. Maybe we can read from that quote.
This is one of the most beautiful expressions of his philosophy, really, that pervades the whole book. You might be plunged into deep darkness, but you need to pick out. You read it. It's wonderful.
So Marco Polo expresses his ambition in the storytelling. This is also the aim of my explorations. examining the traces of happiness still to be glimpsed. I gauge its short supply. If you want to know how much darkness there is around you, you must sharpen your eyes, peering at the faint lights in the distance.
This is his practice, sharpening our eyes as readers.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.